You can't give that which you have not. On the Rwandan youth, Kagame, Himbara, and the long memory of a broken country. Written by Gabriel Ndayishimiye. Chapter 5. The Aesthetics of Denial in Political Systems. David Himbara is the only Rwandan academic of our time who has struck even the faintest crack into Kagame's immaculate portrait of himself, a portrait so carefully lacquered with statistics, medals, and foreign praise that one could mistake it for divine right. And yet, Himbara chipped away not with slogans or fury, but with something far more dangerous: clarity. He is the first Rwandan thinker to hand us not answers, but instruments, scalpels, not swords, cold, sharp, disciplined tools that teach us how to think like skeptics, how to see the architecture of power and not simply its paint. He did not set out to save us. He simply stopped lying, and in doing so, made it harder for the rest of us to keep pretending we did not know. And I resent him for it sometimes. Because his refusal to perform the comforting rituals of outrage forced me to confront the truth in myself, that I had needed someone like him to make my seeing permissible, that I had waited. And in waiting, I had already chosen which side I was on. By the time our conversations began circling one another like wounded animals too exhausted to strike, David Himbara no longer preached. He no longer protested either. He bore the appearance of a man who had once believed deeply, had shouted his belief into the abyss, until the echo that came back mocked him. And then, yes, then, he simply stopped making any sound at all. He wore his burned scars like medals from a war that had not even asked for his service. A war, not of armies or borders, but of belief and betrayal. A war waged through silence and complicity, where loyalty was demanded without question and truth was treated as treason. And I studied those scars with the reverence of a man too frightened to speak aloud what he already knew to be true. I read his writing. May God have mercy on me. I studied it, not as one receives a revelation, but as one watches a surgeon dismember a corpse. Carefully, clinically. He did not rant. He dissected. There were no slogans. There were no grand betrayals, just a calm scalpel, tracing methodical lines across the surface of a nation, pulling back the skin, exposing the pus beneath, and asking, without words, whether we had noticed the smell. There was that interview, broadcast on Al Jazeera. I remember it with unbearable clarity. He sat upright, straight as a ruler, dismantling Rwanda's so-called economic miracle, the way an accountant might reconcile the records of a failed business. He appeared like a bureaucrat of grief, no trembling, no rage. He spoke with the dispassionate tone of a coroner listing injuries. And I sat in silence, struck dumb, not by the weight of his facts, but by how effortlessly they emerged from his mouth. It was grotesque, how civil it all seemed. But no, it was not the blood that unnerved me, not the gore. No, no, no. It was the silence. A silence so carefully constructed, so perfectly engineered, that it could easily be mistaken for virtue. President Paul Kagame, that masterful architect of illusion, understood what most violent men do not, that there is no need to bury the bodies if one simply files them, catalog the dead into quarterly reports, index the disappeared as indicators of fiscal discipline. In this way, atrocity becomes administration. He did not lie. That would have been inelegant. No, He composed, and I applauded. Naturally, I did. We applauded, or, to be more accurate, we did not object. That polite, hollow abstention, that shrug masquerading as neutrality. I told myself that I was only watching, only learning, as though observation alone offered some kind of moral exemption. But silence, when practiced for long enough, develops a spine of complicity. So, yes, that was my first lesson in governance. Silence is not the same as absence. Silence is a craft. It is a design. And when done well, it sparkles like the truth. You will find it in bar graphs, in footnotes, in executive statements and glittering data dashboards. The true horror is not in the killing. It is in the way the killing was made beautiful. The numbers never screamed. They smiled. And that, dear reader, if I can still call you that without contempt, is what disturbed me most of all. PowerPoint presentations in the places where bodies should have been. Boardrooms, international donor conferences, academic symposia. Pie charts in the space where graves belonged. Audited progress reports. Foreign investment briefings. Strategic planning decks circulated in polished folders. Rwanda did not merely disappear its dissidents. It reformatted them. And I had learned those words, had I not? Emerging market. Digital leapfrogging. Vision 2020. I had consumed them like sacred texts, not because I was ignorant, do not flatter me, but because they allowed me to sleep. They were balm. They let me nod along in meetings, nod along in silence. They made the data sing lullabies over the graveyard. I clung to them because they offered a tidy illusion, and I was complicit in my comfort. Order seduced me. Order flattered me, and I mistook that flattery for virtue. I mistook harmony for morality, aesthetic for truth. How easily I became enamored with the elegance of oppression, provided it spoke the language of spreadsheets and mission statements. David Himbara, the bastard, never told me what to think. He did not need to. He allowed the absences to speak for him. But sometimes I wonder, was that even his intention? Or was I simply projecting wisdom onto his silence, disguising my own cowardice as insight? And if I was, then what does that make me now? A parasite of meaning, feeding off someone else's restraint and mistaking it for my own awakening? Perhaps none of us speak without filth clinging to our breath. Perhaps clarity is just another delusion, cleaner only because it does not drip. I would like to believe I learned something from him, but perhaps all I really learned was how to narrate my paralysis with sophistication. There is a voice, low and persistent, that asks, "Who are you to speak now when once you bowed your head and nodded?" I ignore it. Of course I do. What else can I do? But it returns. It always returns. It lingers like mold in the corners of my thoughts, seeps into my sentences, curdles behind every word. It stains the page before the ink even touches it. A rot beneath the surface, familiar, fetid, and entirely mine. So, I wrote, or tried to. Not essays, not arguments, only fragments, confessions scribbled by a man who does not believe in redemption. Small rebellions against the polished grammar of my former belief. Yes, but also pitiful rituals of self-flagellation. Sentences that quivered on the page like half-formed apologies, as if ashamed of being born in a mind so long marinated in cowardice. Sometimes I deleted them, mid-keystroke, like I was trying to put the shame back into the bottle. Sometimes I burned the paper, just to watch something finally disappear on my own terms. The very act of writing felt treacherous, yes, but not noble, pathetic, grotesque. A fool's performance in a theater where no one is watching. But then again, so did silence. And no, this was not a political education. That would be far too noble a label. This was a dismantling, a disinfection, an unlearning of the lies I had once repeated with such eloquent cadence. I recall a line from a policy memorandum. Redistribution mechanisms will target underperforming human capital zones. That meant prisons. That meant death. That meant a bureaucratic execution so efficient it did not even require mourning. Himbara ceased being a hero in my eyes. Of course I had worshipped him. What else is a guilty mind to do with someone who managed to walk away? That worship was cheap penance, really. A way of cloaking my paralysis in borrowed righteousness. I called him a prophet, so I would not have to speak myself. But eventually, the sheen wore off. I stopped seeing him as a savior and started seeing the irony. He was the architect of the very myth he now dismantles, brick by elegant brick. He offers no manifestos, only tools, not passion, but precision. And I envy that restraint the way a coward envies the man who stood up and walked out of the room while I stayed seated, staring at the door, waiting for permission to feel betrayed. That, above all, is what I attempted to learn, not what to say, but how to think in a room where truth had long since been dragged into the alley and shot behind the ear, where inconvenient questions were not just scrubbed from the media, but cauterized from the public imagination, where state-run narratives spilled like disinfectant across everything, numbing even the impulse to doubt, where the law did not merely criminalize dissent, it made it absurd. Treason became a word applied to tone, to posture, to an unguarded facial twitch. And the rest of us, we learned to mistrust even our own memories, to revise our recollections mid-sentence, smiling all the while, nodding through the rot. Thinking in such a room was not brave. It was borderline masochism, a form of mental self-harm, performed without witness, without applause, and worst of all, without reward. Attention, I have come to understand, is not neutral. It is an act of loyalty, yes, but perhaps not to truth or justice, as I once pretended. Perhaps it is loyalty to pain itself, to the sweet, private thrill of noticing what others refuse to see, a self-made martyrdom of the intellect, bearing witness. What does that even mean? Another vanity, another costume. Is it not just the performance of moral clarity in the absence of courage? I paid attention, yes. I paid and paid and paid, and now I cannot unsee. But what has it bought me? Not clarity, not justice, just this corrosive intimacy with horror. You cannot return to the voice you once used, back when you still believed. That voice becomes foreign. It whimpers. Then it rots in your throat, unspoken, unspeakable. And in its place, perhaps, something more honest begins to emerge. Not louder, not more articulate, but less afraid.